Hi, I'm Jackie Stapleton and welcome to ATOL TV. If you've made it here, it means that you might just love ISO standards as much as me and you are truly interested and possibly even excited about learning more about them. Well, you've come to the right place. Welcome back, George. I know today we are discussing clause 6.1 as a whole. Is that right?
That's right. So we'll look at the actions to address risks and opportunities clause, 6.1, which then comprises 6.11, 6.12, 6.13.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to let you start sharing the story if you like.
Okay, cool. So yeah, as I said, 6.1, which is actions to address risks and opportunities, comes under 6, which is planning. Within that, we've got 3 subclauses, which are 6.11, which is general, 6.12, which is information security risk assessment, and 6.13, which is the information security risk treatment. Later on, when you take a look at clause 8, you'll see some themes that carry through. I think the key thing here is that it sits under planning. So this is really about planning around those risks and opportunities. If I run through 6.11, this is about making sure there's consideration to clauses 4.1 and 4.2 when determining the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. For a bit of a refresher, that's understanding the organization and its context and understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So when you're planning your risks and opportunities, you need to have consideration of that to make sure that you're addressing the requirements that you've identified previously. Should I go down into 6.12?
Yeah, like you pull it all together however your brain wants to share it with everyone. Can I just share one thing I've picked up and I want to reiterate? And I know we talked about this when we recorded clause 6, but I just want to reiterate. Yeah, clause 8. Sorry, I meant to say.
I know, because we recorded them the other way around.
Yes, we've done it backwards.
Gone back in time.
And I wanted to reconfirm with you, like we're doing clause 6 now, and obviously it's got that information security risk assessment and it's got the information security risk treatment. Remember, this is about planning this risk assessment, planning this risk treatment. When you get to clause 8, which we've already recorded, watch it for sure. But I just wanted to confirm with you, George, as you said, there's pretty much the same clause names. 8.2 is information security risk assessment. 8.3 is information security risk treatment. But the difference is in clause 8, it's actually doing it. We're implementing what you set out to plan here. Is that right?
That's right. And what's interesting is that it's almost intertwined because you're planning in clause 6 to do the information security risk assessment piece, and you're really undertaking that assessment in 8.2, but then you're sort of stepping back into 6 to plan the treatments before going back to 8 to actually implement the treatments. So you're kind of bouncing to and fro because the doing is later. You plan this, you do this, and then on the output of that, you go and plan how you treat that, and then you've got to go and do the treatment and implement the controls. So yeah, it can get a little bit confusing. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not exactly sequential in that sense.
And would I be thinking correctly, like in this stage of planning, you're coming up with what you think the potential risks are and assessing them and treating them? When you actually get to clause 8 and you're implementing things, would you come across other stuff then and you go, oh, whoops, I've actually didn't realize that this has the potential to occur. And you flick back to 6 and go, oh, we need to include this as part of the plan?
That absolutely does happen. So you can identify new risks as you implement treatment plans for others. I mean, I think within the information security, cybersecurity space, you're often finding things because I guess you're not expected to know absolutely everything when you're just doing your first risk assessment. I think the other thing that I see a lot too is the depth. So, when many organizations start to do a risk assessment in the early days when they have a lower level of maturity, a lot of them will try and keep a high level risk. It'll kind of be more, in motherhood statements isn't probably the right word, but it's sort of at that level. And then as the organization matures, they start to dig down into the detail as they start to uncover things. So, what I'm saying here is at a very high level, which would satisfy the requirements of ISO anyway, an organization may say, we're identifying that there's a risk of a data breach without a lot of detail, but we know that there's a risk and we have to apply these particular controls. But then as things go on, they might be like, oh, in this specific system, there's this specific issue. And then that will often link back so that risk assessment process becomes more in depth as the maturity evolves. So a lot of back and forth type stuff.
Yeah.
I think the key thing with 612 with information security risk assessment is it's about defining that process. And so you're sort of establishing the elements such as the risk criteria. For example, thinking about things like risk appetite, risk tolerance, how you're going to rate those risks, and all that type of stuff is what happens within this particular clause. And so it needs to be something that can be repeated. You need to be able to basically reapply it over and over again so that it's consistent and so that you kind of, when I say comparing apples for apples, you're not using effectively like a different scale. This is where we sort of see the matrices come along. So when you've got your risk assessment matrix, you'll see that in other standards as well. That sort of likelihood impact type stuff.
Yeah.
That's often an artifact that comes out of this. And then also developing things like the rating criteria. Depending on how that's done, it can be using either qualitative or quantitative measurements, which I think I talked a bit about in the content. Can you assign a quantifiable dollar value to it? Or is there a qualitative assessment that needs to take place? And then where does that fall in the matrix? Following on that, what is the appetite of the organization? At what point do we say, hey, we need to do something about this, which then kind of follows into your treatments? Or do we risk accept it? That's all the stuff that's created and implemented in 612.
Okay, that's really interesting. I like how, and I think you mentioned it when we talked about clause 8 as well, about that risk appetite. Taking it back a step, you talked about risk matrix and the consequence, likelihood, etc. Does the standard give you any guidance as to what that should look like? So when people are implementing, where do they find this information out? What should that look like?
It's not going to give you specific numbers. It's an organizational decision. So typically top management would determine what those numbers should be and what those thresholds effectively are. But in terms of like an overall kind of standardized way of approaching it, or a framework, if you may, there are many different ways to do that. And so there's not a prescriptive selection from ISO 27001 that says you shall use this risk management framework, but there are available resources. For example, the one that aligns with this from an ISO perspective really well is 27005, which is the risk management standard related to the 27,000 family, so the information security. You can choose to use it. Many organizations that have already implemented something like ISO 31000 will leverage that. Might not use ISO and they might use the NIST risk management framework, 837 special publication. Some organizations may create their own. You've got options as long as what you're using is, and I think in the words of the standard, ensuring that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. So that's the key thing. I think it needs to be consistent and reproducible.
Repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent and comparable result. Regards to, it's not very prescriptive in what risk matrix to use. You've given us some great external tools. Is that what 612 is talking about, where it says criteria for performing information security risk assessment? So that's that consistent criteria that you're talking about.
It is that, and it's also about when you do an information security risk assessment. A lot of the time, if you look at it, I'm making a very generalist comment, but when you talk about risk, you talk about when you do it. In 8, they talk about at planned intervals as well as when there's significant change. Part of that criteria would be if you're implementing a new project that has implications to information or information assets, information security, then that is part of that criteria. So you need to do a risk assessment. If there's a significant vulnerability that comes out, for example, then that will be the criteria. So sort of what triggers that risk assessment, as well as, and thou shalt do a risk assessment every 12 months or 6 months or 3 months. That's not prescribed by the standard, but you've established that criteria. Whatever top management say, those your sort of board directors, the executives say, hey, and that will be based on appetite as well. If you're a very sort of, I guess, risk adverse organization, maybe you want to do them more often, or if there's a lot of change that happens. So it's about understanding that criteria and having that documented.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Again, so it's not just winging it and doing it whenever.
Yeah, okay, so you do have that structure, and I know I've got Clause 612 in front of me. It is actually quite detailed. There's a lot in there to guide you, even though it's not prescriptive, but it certainly gives you a really good idea of what the requirements are that I need to undertake during this assessment.
And I feel like 27001 is very risk-based. So, everything hinges on the fact that you've done a risk assessment and that you've selected appropriate treatment controls. And then the next part is doing the implementation of those controls and then the improvement aspect of it. So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that it's so lengthy.
And now we've got to go to risk treatment as well, and you can go wherever you want. But I've just had a thought. Recently, someone mentioned something about cyber insurance, which sort of tweaked my interest because, our business or training is all online. I just said it. So it's obviously very important for us. Someone mentioned that your insurance premium is influenced, or the insurer will take into consideration if the company has done a thorough risk assessment and they've got a business continuity plan and response plans if an incident does occur. Is that something you've heard of as well?
Oh, 100%. So I think specifically I'm going to talk about Australia. So, if we wind the clock back, almost a decade now, when cyber insurance was kind of a new thing, it was a bit of the Wild West and no one really knew. It was a bit of finger in the air. What do the premiums look like? How do you determine whether this is a good organization to insure, and all that sort of stuff. So it was a bit kind of immature. And so as time has progressed and over the last 5-6 years, there's been a significant increase in the requirements from the insurer. They want to see specific controls in place because that will determine whether they've got to pay out, they've got to pay a claim. And so I remember if you go back to even sort of 2018, 2019, I started to see a lot more of that because things like ransomware and so forth were coming in. At that point, it was still probably in the early days of insurance, but they were saying, do you have these very specific controls in place? And you could join the dots and say, oh yeah, this is because of the ransomware stuff and the business email compromise. So do you have multi-factor? Do you have backups on a different network? And do you do app control and all that sort of stuff? Fast forward again for the last 2 to 3 years, what I've seen is that premiums have gone up and up. And the way to get those down often, and I'm not saying that I can guarantee that your premium is going to go down, but what I've actually seen in practice is once an organization gets something like ISO 27001, and in this particular instance, it was ISO 27001, taking it to the insurer and seeing either reduction or no increase in premium.
Yep.
And that's because what's happening now is by taking something like 27001, getting a independent external audit of your information security management system, which says, hey, we are doing risk management, we've selected these controls and they're operating as they should, and someone independent has reviewed it and given us this certificate, it's better for the insurer because the chances that they're going to have to pay out on a premium are now reduced. So I've seen even with premiums generally going up, that premiums have not gone up for a particular organization because they've got 27001 certified.
Okay.
100% a thing. I saw that late last year and the year before.
Interesting. So that's obviously another benefit of implementing 27001.
Absolutely. And also there's been quite a bit of talk at the moment around regulators and what they're doing. And there's certainly been some in the media around regulatory action against organizations. Again, having something like 27001 starts to help with reducing the impact potentially. Again, I'm not saying it actually will, but generally it can help with those types of things as well. So if you have an incident and you've done absolutely everything that you can to a standard, which is considered a best practice standard, then that's going to look a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, like if you have an incident, and I might be jumping the gun here and it might be somewhere completely outside of clause 6 in the standard, but that's what I thought of before. Here in clause 6, you're doing the planning, okay, for your risk assessment and your risk treatment, ready for implementation in your operations clause 8. Is there anywhere in the standard that maybe closes the loop because you've assessed it, you're putting risk treatment in? If an incident does occur, is there any requirement for response plans or a plan on how you're actually going to respond to an incident that you may have already identified has the potential to occur?
Kind of related to 6 and 8. So it's an annex item, right? There are a bunch of Annex A items related to incident management. So 524, 525, 526, 527, and 528, maybe 529 as well, are all related to incident management. So when you think about a risk in terms of risk assessment, one of the things in 612 is a paragraph about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I talked about that in 8 as well. So when you think about an incident is generally going to be something that threatens confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So it could be confidentiality, e.g. data breach. It could be integrity, e.g. corruption. So think about your ransomware type scenarios, or it could be availability, which could be your ransomware style scenarios, but it's often related to things like outages. So like denial of service type stuff or equipment that's old and rickety and falling over. All that sort of stuff is relevant. And so when you identify risks that relate to those types of things, let's talk about data breach, for example, breach of confidentiality of information. Then you look at the annex controls, and I guess we are jumping to the next piece now, but this is where you'll have 524 saying information security incident management planning and preparation. So this is where you're starting to plan for information security incidents. So you're defining and establishing that plan, which includes communication, processes, roles, all that sort of stuff. And then as you step down from 524, 525, 526 is the actual response. And then 527 is things like lessons learned, what went well, what didn't, why did this happen, how do we stop it from happening again? And then 528 is collection of evidence, so digital forensics type stuff, which will be all woven into that. It is all interlinked. In other words, if you've got that on your risk register data breach, which I'm pretty sure most, if not all organizations will have, and you've selected appropriate controls, you should therefore have included those incident response controls, which means that you would have an incident response plan to handle that should that risk be realized.
And I think you're right. So really that does all fall under 613, your risk treatment, because in 613, they're actually already referencing Annex A. And some of those controls from Annex A, in my experience in other ISO standards, they are sort of requirements. Like, to me, they seem like more than controls. I get that they're controls, but very specific, aren't they?
When I try to explain to folks what's the difference between 27001 and Annex A, and you also see 27002 pop up as well. And you'll notice that 27001 Annex A and 27002 look kind of the same because they are, in terms of the list of controls, they are the same. The difference is that the 002 standard focuses on control guidance, so there's a bit more detail to it. In other words, when you're an implementer implementing the controls, you need control guidance, use 27002 because that detail isn't in Annex A in the 001 standard document. My point was that the 001 controls, as they are all considered mandatory. So when an auditor looks at the standard, an organization needs to have done all the 001 controls. So all the 27001 controls, all those clauses need to be implemented. That's not negotiable.
Yeah, there's no areas that are not applicable.
No, and I think from memory in 9000, some of them can be made not applicable.
Correct, 9001.
That's not the case in 27001. So they are all applicable. Where they can be potentially not applicable is in the Annex A controls list. So as you think about from a systems view, if you've got 20 systems, you might apply the same control multiple times to different systems. You'll see things like, cryptography applied many times because it will be applicable to the particular asset. So that's what's a little bit different about it. The interesting thing with the Annex A controls, and it's definitely worth raising, is that, and it is part of 613, once you've done your risk assessment and you select those treatment controls and you build out those treatment plans, so you would have a treatment plan for each of the risk items, and you'd say to treat this risk, these are the controls that are applicable. You have to create a statement of applicability documents, which includes those necessary controls. What's really important is you need to justify their inclusion or their exclusion.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like, we included this because, for example, maybe it's a business continuity requirement, maybe top management said so, maybe it's a requirement of a piece of legislation. You need to say why. I've seen organizations do that as a columns and just say it's a reg, top management's tick, tick, tick. And then where there's an exclusion, that tends to be a bit more wordy. And often it'll be something like, we do not do in-house development, for example. There are some controls very specific to software development. If you don't do that, or it's not within the scope of your ISMS, it can be scoped out. That's one that I see quite a bit. So for example, secure development lifecycle or secure coding is one. Secure coding 828, I often see that scoped out because an organization doesn't develop anything in-house.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so that sort of does align to the 9001 scope where things can be deemed as not applicable. When they're not, you need to have justification for it. But this is obviously in relation to Annex A, the controls, not the clauses. Plus, because there's 93 in there's quite a significant document then, this statement of applicability.
It is, and it's interesting because it was reduced, right? So I think it was 115, something like that.
Oh, was it?
So it's actually shrunk, but it's a bit of a sneaky one actually, because in ISO 27001 2022, there are 20 odd less controls than in the 2013 standard. But if you actually go through it, there's actually kind of more controls. Now that you're sitting there going, what they've done is, and I think a criticism of 2013, at least I was critical of it, was there was a lot of overlap and repeat. So you would see controls that like, wait, that just sounds like that control. And so you're effectively just using the same evidence to evidence the same control that was up there. What ISO did was a lot of consolidation where it made sense and controls are effectively repeated, but they had to make it modern. They had to apply to today's information security, cybersecurity landscape and environments. They had to add things like web filtering, threat intelligence is new. You tested me on what the other new ones are. A cloud is in there a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Technically before, cloud would have been in there under the supply chain stuff, but now it's exclusively cloud.
Yeah.
So they've done that sort of thing. So there was a few new things that were added in the newer version.
And we've gotten to this point and they've got this statement of applicability. And as you said, there's some sort of response plan in place for an incident. Is there a requirement where it's applicable to test those response plans?
Yeah. So there is, I feel like there is a control for it as well.
Oh,
Sure, it was in there. I need to pull open the 002 document.
search on test.
That'll work.
It is ICT readiness. That's a control maintained and tested. Well, that's backup tested. Security test. It's there. You're right.
Not to be confused with the test data. As I said, I'm pretty sure it's in there. It's good practice anyway. There's no point if you put it all together and you don't test and don't know if it works until something actually happens.
Exactly. So, okay. So that's really part of those controls, which makes sense because, testing is a control, isn't it?
Well, and 530, which is ICT readiness for business continuity. So that's not specifically around, like that's more of a BCP type thing. That
Yes.
also in 001 talks about testing. So ICT readiness shall be planned, implemented, maintained, and tested based on business continuity objectives and ICT continuity objectives. So that's one as well. So
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of that whole cycle. Is there anything else you think? I know I sort of ask questions and well, luckily maybe it's included what clause 6 sort of talks about. Is there anything else in that 6.1 sort of range that is worth covering, George?
yeah, documentation. So again, this is one of those shall be. So, where you are doing your information security risk assessment, risk treatment, processes and so forth, they shall be documented and retained. So it is one way you have to have that particular evidence and the auditor will look for that. Yeah, that's probably another critical one. So you can't just
Absolutely.
say, we did it without demonstrating that you have done it.
Yeah, I'm looking now. 612, the risk assessment shall retain, and same with 613 shall retain. So that's records, that's evidence that that's actually being done.
Yeah, so you typically have like a document of your process that contains how you do it and metrics in terms of your risk appetite and your matrices, and you'd have your risk register typically that has all those bits of information, and then you'd have your risk treatment plans as separate artifacts. So yeah, those you would need to make sure you've got. So and as an auditor, you would be reviewing that to make sure it's all up to scratch.
Okay, so you've heard it straight from George's mouth. Auditors will be looking for that evidence for 612 and 613 because the standard says so.
And the statement of applicability. Typically, when scoping out an audit, you would ask for the statement of applicability, the scope statement. You could try asking for a risk register. Sometimes that's met with like, way, we're not going to share that, but you will want to cite it at some point.
And is the risk register a typical output of those clauses? Is that sort of normally what you see?
Yeah. So the risk register is a very typical output. Yeah, I think it does speak to what should be in that register. So things like who owns the risk, that would need to be in there. Those levels, likelihood, impact type stuff will be in there. Obviously, description of what the risk is, and then you can add additional columns. The one thing that I did mention, I think, with clause 8, which is still relevant, is that some certification bodies will want to see which of the CIA, the confidential and integrity availability, that risk, and it could be one or more, aligns to. So if you look at 612C1, it talks about, associating with the loss of confidential integrity and availability. So there are some bodies that will say, have you captured that in your risk register?
Oh, that's where it comes from. Yeah. Okay. So, it is actually in there, which CB, but no, because instantly as an auditor myself, I think, well, where are they getting that from? Where they're making that stuff up? But it is actually there in, as you said, 612C1, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I love that that's CIA. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you, George. If you're ready to wrap this up, if you feel you've covered everything, because your last thing that you said was important, and I agree, absolutely, is the retention of documented information, so evidence. What's your parting words for this?
Well, I was just going to say, and that can be in many forms. Like it could be a spreadsheet, it could be within a GRC system. A lot of times it's a mix of things, Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's pretty much it. A bit of effort goes into this because there's really a lot of what drives the complex elements of this standard, because this is where you're saying, here are the risks that are relevant to our, internal and external stakeholders and context of the organization. Here's all this sort of stuff. Here are the risks, we've rated them. Here are the controls we need to implement. It's about planning all of that in clause 8 going forth and doing that.
What you identify here will drive the behavior and follow-up activities for the rest of the system, because this is the key point.
Absolutely.
That's an awesome way to end it. Thanks, George.
No worries.
Clearly, you are truly dedicated to learning more about ISO standards. I love having you learn with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Auditor Training Online is a recognized training provider, and we know how it works in the real world. So we are confident that we can help you to make a change in your life and join the most sought after profession out there. Go to our website and enroll in our training to transform your work and industry experience into a recognized qualification and career. And also, don't forget to subscribe to ATOL TV and leave a comment or question, as I truly do want to help you to join the best career out there with me.